All right, well, with that in mind, Finance Minister Tito Mboweni will on Wednesday present his emergency supplementary budget as the economic fallout from COVID-19 continues to intensify. Economists say that the budget is likely to show an economy in depression with falling GDP numbers. The country is facing its worst jobs bloodbath in a decade, escalating debt and an expected shortfall in tax collection of more than 300 billion rand. The country is also likely to borrow from international financial institutions. Well, to make sense of how the country will further protect itself from further job losses and how South Africa will deal with a dramatic decline in tax revenues, we've asked political economist Dr. Dale McKinley to join us via Skype. Thanks so much indeed for joining us. Welcome to the programme.
Thank you, Peter. Thank you very much.
All right, Tito Mboweni must have the toughest job of any finance minister in the world at the minute.
He's sitting in the hot seat for sure. I think, as we said before this interview began, it's not a good time to be a finance minister in any country, but particularly in our country, because obviously we had a great deal happening before this, as your insert previously talked about. So yeah, he's got a very tough job, and I think there's a lot of expectations, and it's going to be very, very interesting, because depending upon who you talk to, in terms of what is expected in this budget speech, one can get a lot of very different answers to what is going to happen. So from my estimation, I think what he's going to do is he's going to adopt a fairly cautious approach. I don't think there's going to be any huge, major announcements. I think what he's going to try to do is to stabilize the general expenditure patterns, the redirection, the reprioritization of funds that have already been announced, 130 billion, for example, in support for smaller scale enterprises and medium scale enterprises, as well as for UIF. And also, I think he's going to basically try to say that we're not going to go to the IMF cap in hand. We're not going to go borrow massively on the international market. We're going to try to source for reprioritization and domestic borrowing as well. So I think what he's going to try to do is stick to a fairly cautious approach and not rock the boat too much, and hope that the damage at the end of the year is not a great deal, so that when he does his budget for 2021, he can then basically announce some kind of decent news.
All right, cautious approach, but I would suggest that what's required is probably a major overhaul, because before COVID-19, we had a patient, the South African economy, in the emergency area, about to be wheeled into perhaps intensive care. That jobs numbers tells us that we were in a mess. So even without COVID-19, the cautious approach wasn't going to work. Surely now what's required is some kind of surgery of major proportions.
I would completely agree with you, Peter, and I think that many of us were quite disappointed, in fact, right at the beginning of this outbreak, when the economic stimulus package was announced. Even though it sounded a huge amount, 500 billion, if you actually broke the numbers down, the actual expenditure was mostly just shifting the budget from here and there. So Tito Mboweni has adopted across the board a fairly cautious approach, but I would agree that what we need is radical surgery. And unfortunately, you're not going to get that in a budget, and certainly not an emergency budget. What we need in this country is structural reforms. We need fundamental changes in the way in which we create jobs, in the way in which our market operates. But what Tito Mboweni's hands are tied to a certain extent, because at the one level, he can't announce major changes in the expenditure, taxes, for example, and these kinds of things. And on the other hand, he's getting pressure from a whole range of different constituencies that want very different things. So he's basically, that's why I say cautious, even though I don't think many of us are going to be very pleased, because we're expecting something more radical, and it's just not going to happen.
All right, so let's try and break this down in sort of layman's kind of terms. So much like the budget that I have at home, at the end of the month, I expect a salary, which is X amount, and I have all these expenses that I have to deal with. So South Africa is the same. He has revenue that comes from various sources, mostly tax, and with the declining economy, that means the income that he can get through taxes has shrunk significantly. but the expenses, even before all this drama, weren't going to go down. How does one balance that kind of budget where your income is short, you now have COVID-19, your boss has said, listen, I need 500 billion to put into this emergency fund, and you're only getting so much money coming in? What does Tito Mboweni do? Where is he going to get this 500 billion plus all the other things that he needs to pay for?
Well, your analogy is a good one, because most people, basically, their only option is to go into debt. And unfortunately, that's where we're going. We're already into quite a bit of debt, but I think we're going to have to go into more debt. All the projections that one looks at, I mean, some of them are fairly dire, but if you look by the beginning of next year, we could actually have a GDP ratio debt of upwards of 80%. And that's a jump of 10 to 15% from where we were a year ago. So essentially, there's going to be increased debt to finance some of this new expenditure, to plug some of the holes. And the other way that he's going to do is juggle the budget. In other words, he's going to redirect expenditure. You cut the pie differently. You take from one section and you push to another. And that's going to be a balancing act, because then you have to basically assume, well, what are the areas which need most of the impetus and most of the stimulus, and which are the ones that we can leave a little bit aside? So there's going to be winners and losers here in this budget. It's not going to please everybody. And the other point is that we're going to have to accept the fact that right now, because of the structural nature of our economy, that just simply to put it all on the finance minister and to expect that he's going to pull out a magic wand and start weaving it is simply unrealistic. We need to have the political will to change the way that our economy operates. And then the finance minister would have much more leeway, I think, to really reprioritize expenditure and move in a positive direction. Right now, it's crisis management. Just like you would in a family, you're going to have to cut, you're going to have to crisis manage, you're going to have to go into a bit of debt, and you're going to have to pull in your stomach. And that's the question, is who's going to be pulling in their stomachs more than others?
All right. So, I mean, there might be a little relief, because with lockdown, there was spending that should have happened but didn't. And I suppose some of that money might help contribute to this deficit.
There's going to be some money that's going to be made available, yes. But for example, let's take where there's going to be extra funds that might need to be made available that are not going to necessarily increase growth or jobs. So the public sector wage bill, the unions are basically threatening to shut down the state if they don't get their 37 billion. Well, that's 37 billion that could have gone somewhere else. So that's going to have to move in that direction. So yes, there might be some funds that would have been loosened up. But if you take, for example, simply just the expenditure that's going to have to be made to save small and medium-sized enterprises, which hasn't even begun, really, I mean, maybe 30 to 40% of that fund has been accessed so far. That's where most of the money is going to need to go. The question for Tito, and I think for the country, is going to be, where is he going to prioritize? Is it going to be the small person? Is it going to be the small businesses? Or are we once again going to see, like in many other countries, big bailouts for the corporations, for state-owned enterprises, and the ordinary person is basically left to fend for themselves? I think that's going to be the fundamental issue in this budget, and that's a very, very important question.
All right, so he talks about tightening the belt even further to avoid a sovereign debt crisis by 2024. Some people say that we might already be there. And I just wonder, how close are we to that crisis point where we essentially are owing much more than 100% of what we're earning?
Well, we're moving in that direction. As I said, the projections for just, if one looks at next year, would go to something maybe even close to 80%. And then by, as you say, 2022, 2023, topping over 100%. So the question is, we will go in that direction if there's not radical surgery. So it's not going to happen tomorrow. What we're going to do is we're going to get a holding budget, I think, a sort of shifting of the deck chairs. The question is, when he presents his budget in February, if Tito is still our finance minister at that point, and when is there enough political will to bite the bullet to begin to really structurally change our economy. If we begin to do that, and we could obviously get into a fairly long discussion about what that means, then we have the possibility to reverse that potential debt crisis. Because we can basically, if we have an expansionary budget, if it's put in the proper areas of the economy, but if our political class is timid and they don't want to bite the bullet and they basically just want to hold things, we're going to move in one direction and one direction only, which is crisis management, debt levels which are unsustainable, and inequality levels which are going to basically push us into a situation in this country in which conflict, both socially and politically, is going to increase.
All right. I think that's where we'll leave it for today. Thanks so much indeed, Dr. McKinley. Let's see what the Finance Minister does come up with tomorrow, but I suspect he's not going to get much sleep tonight. Thanks so much.